I republished this book this year to update it over what has happened and not happened in the last 17 years. There are a number of myths associated with the British Home Child Immigration Scheme. And the first myth is the myth of numbers. Nobody knows how many children were sent to Canada. Estimates range from 80,000 to 120,000, totally unsubstantiated by any data. So my opinion is as good as anybody else's, and I believe 150,000 children were not emigrated, sent, or shipped. They were deported to Canada. Immigration means a voluntary choice. A child cannot make a voluntary choice of which country he wants to go to. All of these children are given a choice. An 8-year-old is asked, do you want to go to Canada or do you want to go to Australia? What child is in a position to make that kind of choice? They were not given a choice of staying in England. So it is more properly called the British Home Child Deportation Scheme. They were deported because they were not wanted. A primary motive to the scheme was a Victorian illusion of creating a working class servant class in Canada. Girls were trained, which I call brainwashed, into being domestic servants, because the Victorian attitude at the time was Canada needs servants. Boys were trained, also brainwashed, into being farm laborers. And they were sold and they were bought by the Canadian government. A scheme can be defined in many ways. I define this scheme as a foolish, ill-founded, malicious effort. It was never about the best interests of children. It was about ridding a society of its poor. The second primary myth is the myth of the orphan. It served the organization's purposes to portray children abandoned, running around, little match girl, all the myths of the late 18th century, and child savers that were saving them from a fate worse than death. The reality is, out of 150,000 children, they did not have 300,000 parents who were killed. I think we all would have noticed that in the first half of this century. Maybe 1%, maybe 2% were orphaned. But being orphaned doesn't mean you do not have an extended family. My father was not an orphan. 99% of these children weren't orphans. They were poor. And that was enough to be seen as a sin and a failure on the part of parents who need to be punished for their inability temporarily to not be able to provide for their children. The sanctimonious child savers took it upon themselves to remove children illegally, forcibly, for whatever reasons they had. It was enough to simply disapprove of a family. Unmarried couple living in sin, that was enough to remove their children. In my father's case, he was 3.5 years old. It was illegal to apprehend children under the age of 4, but that didn't stop them. He had an extended family. He had parents, he had grandparents, he had uncles, he had aunts, he had cousins. He had 30-odd people in his family the day he was forcibly removed by the police from his family. And no one opposed this. It was endorsed. It was approved of. Get rid of children. Another myth was the myth of a better life in Canada. Oh my God, if children were left running on the streets, unattended, clothed, unfed. They must be saved. From who? Their families. The Victorians regarded the families as their evil associations. The Waifs and Strays Society, highly publicized policy, was to do all things expedient to remove children from their evil associations. The first step of coming into care was to completely sever family ties. Families weren't told where their children were. They didn't disappear, they were disappeared. The second step in the process was to orphanize them, which is very simple. You tell a child his mother's dead. Any child will believe that if they never see their parents again, they never have any contact with their families. It's easy to convince a child they're an orphan. In a separate segment, I'll clearly define the brainwashing process, because it is a process. And it starts with removing physically a child from his family, not allowing any contact with the family, and creating the organization as the new family. Girls had to call their caretakers mother in the homes they were. Boys had to call their caretakers master or massa. And raised in the environments of the home, never mind the inadequate food, the inadequate clothing, they weren't allowed to speak. They could speak for 1 hour after supper quietly. If they spoke during the day, it was a check mark. If they got 7 check marks, they were caned every night. It was called the punishment circle, and my dad wrote about it. Every night they formed a circle. Every night they tallied up all the offenses, and they caned children. The other children were forced to watch. So if you have a child that's not allowed to speak, kind of hard to develop a vocabulary. If you have a child and you take its name away from him, if you become boy number 14, you're boy number 14, and you are an orphan. That's it, that's all. If you used your name, a check mark was against you. If you used another child's name, a check mark was against you. If you were at the public school, you marched quietly with your head down. You didn't look up, you didn't talk to anyone, you didn't talk to any other person like the public. And again, a check mark. So what you had to look for at the end of the day, just before supper, was the daily caning routine. The psychological impact of that, never mind if you were being caned, imagine standing in a room of 6 and 8 and 10-year-olds watching another kid get caned. You couldn't comment about it, so you stared off into space, you disassociated, and a whole bunch of psychological damage was done. And this was the process. The final myth was the better life in Canada. Poor little orphans on the street, uncared for, the child savers would save them, train them or brainwash them into being servants, passive, subservient, meek, and with no identity because they didn't have a name. Better life in Canada? They were sold as indentured laborers, slavery. 6, 8, 10-year-old kids worked 14 hours a day on a farm. The vast majority were not allowed into the farmer's home for fear of contamination by their inherited genetic weaknesses. Far too many slept in the barns with the animal. My father was allowed into a farmhouse, but he ate in the corner of the kitchen alongside the dog. Not allowed to talk to anybody. My father was fortunate because he came in 1925. He was 15. Had he came in 1924, he would not have long pants to wear in the winter on the farm. As bad as the treatment of the children was in England, it could have been mitigated by a little more humane treatment in Canada. It might have made up for the damage that was done. The reality was the ill treatment they received in England was compounded many, many times in Canada. They weren't welcome. They were stigmatized, they were prejudiced against. There was a genetic belief that they would contaminate the Canadian gene pool. One of the hardest things my father had to admit was, while riding boxcars during the Depression, as hundreds of thousands of other men did, he came across English need not apply signs. Oh, Canada. He had to disguise his English accent while looking for work. What was sent over to Canada were damaged children with no identities. Well, they had a brand new one. It was called home child, orphan, gutter snipe, thief, contaminated. And how do you carry an identity like that all your life? The other common factor of every child, there might have been a few exceptions, they simply never saw their families again. Once they were in care, they belonged to the organization. Once out of care, they still wore the identity of old boy, old girl. They belonged to the organization. Bernardo's, Quarriers, Middlemore, it didn't matter, there were 50 of them. But the only identity they had was the organization that they belonged to. Bernardo boasted they were no one's children. Therefore, that allowed him to claim them as his own, treat them as his own, and forever own them. The long-term aftermath of the theft of identities, generation of generations of descendants continue to look for stolen identities. My father lived a great deal of his life wondering if his name was really Snow. He certainly wrote to the Waifs and Strays long enough to find out, 60 years, and they didn't tell him anything. I took another 3 years to find out everything I needed to know. But it wasn't easy, and it's not getting any easier.